Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to In the Company of Charity podcast by the Daughters of Charity. And I'm Sister Liz, and I'm here as always with my sister friend, Sister Elizabeth Grime. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, Sister Liz. How are you?
Good. We are in a very important week this week, going into vow retreat and renovation.
Yes, I'm sure all the listeners know exactly what we're talking about.
So explain that. Explain.
Explain
So
that. So each year, the Daughters of Charity renew their vows. Now, it doesn't mean we just do a little anniversary, like remembering them. Our vows are actually annual. That means they're renewable all the time and they're annual. They're non-religious and they are
always
annual and they're always renewable. So that means each year we renew, we take them again, which is a long process. We start actually like in November asking permission. I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but we
yes.
ask permission to renew our vows. And then in February, we get a lovely letter from the Superioress General on one of the vows or an aspect of our life on the Feast of the Presentation, where she's presented our petitions to make the vows to the Superior General of the Congregation of the Mission. And we look forward to getting this letter. And then on the Feast of the Annunciation, which is usually in March 25th, or this year, it's
Was
April
moved.
8th. It's moved. It's a movable feast. So it's not, when we say they're annual, it doesn't mean 365 days. It means feast day to feast day. I thought the first time, wow, I did the March 25th last year, April
Yeah, so
6th this year.
I mean,
I got a week there. No, no,
that's
no.
not how it works.
We renew them as in the spirit of renewing them every year for the rest of our lives. So,
Yeah.
anyways, so that's what we're going to be doing. And Daughters of Charity around the world, every one of us, little under 12,000 of us, will do this on the same day. And each of us also makes a retreat, a renovation retreat.
Yeah, so
We kind of intermingle the words renovation and renewal. Um, and they're kind of the same. It's our opportunity to make this commitment again each year, to say yes again. So that's what we're in the midst of, and we're very excited because it's just such a special time.
the three of us from our house are going up to the Benedictine Monastery in Rio Grande City. There are friends down here in the valley, and they have these three little hermitages on their property. They're like tiny, tiny houses. So think of a tiny house and then like cut it in half. This is like super tiny house, and just a beautiful property in the middle of nowhere. And if it's a clear night, the stars will be out, and a beautiful adoration chapel. All of us are super excited to escape our area for a little minute and go spend it out with the Lord on the weekend before making our vows again. So it's going to be real exciting.
That's great. And you're going to make your vows out there. You're going to renew.
Actually, no, we'll do it in town at our regular parish, Queen of Peace, where the priests of the two hearts, the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, those guys have the parish here, and so it's a regular morning mass, 7 a.m., and not too much fanfare. And then, of course, we go off to ministry. It's not like we get the day off and just celebrate and relax. It is, as true daughters of charity, we make our vows and then head to ministry to serve the people that we serve. So it'll be good.
Yeah, I think that's great. This year, we're with Sister Dorothy and I are going to renew our vows. Sister Dorothy's the companion sister here at the seminary, and she and I are going to renew our vows at the parish, 7:30 Mass. I think it's the first time that, because normally we would go with the other sisters. There's a lot of other sisters in the St. Louis area. It's where our provincial offices are, but we just decided this year we wanted to do what we would do if we were out on mission. In the world like everybody else, and it's exciting for the seminary sisters as well. Because they haven't even been sent on mission yet. Their only real experience being on out in the missions is as pre-postulants and postulants. And now I think they're experiencing the renewal of vows in a very different way, because they'll be preparing to do this in about 3 years. So to be making their vows for the first time about 3 or 4 years. So yeah, so it's very exciting. It's really exciting time. So
Mm,
just happens there's a priest who will be filling in for our pastor, and he's very associated with the CMs, knows them very well, and has done masses for the sisters when they renew their vows. So we're very blessed to have someone who gets it. So we're
yeah,
happy
that
with that.
always
Yeah.
helps. Very cool. Well, we don't want to talk too much because we have a great episode here, the first of a series on Carville, and it's so fascinating about this book. Listening to Wendy talk about this book, King of the Armadillos, and anything you want to say as a preview to this episode.
Well, yeah, like you, I was very excited to meet Wendy Chin-Tanner, who's the author of King of the Armadillos. We've really developed quite a relationship, friendship around this issue. As for those of you who don't know, at Carville, Louisiana, the government opened the state of Louisiana, and then the government opened back in the late 1800s a leprosarium. It was called. Basically, it was a quarantined place for people who had leprosy at a time when we thought leprosy was highly contagious, a communicable disease, and we were very frightened by it. It has biblical fears around leprosy. Um, we have discovered through science and through the expertise of Daughters of Charity that leprosy is not as contagious and is not so scary. It's a disease that really, yeah, can be very bad around the world. It is still a huge issue, but today we know it as Hansen's disease, and the area where we were at Carville is now a museum. It's no longer housing people who suffer from Hansen's disease, but is now a museum, and it's had other uses. In fact, it was housing for Katrina folks during Katrina. So it's all kinds of history around it, which we'll learn over a number of episodes. So this is just the very first, and through this one, you'll learn about this relationship between Wendy Chin-Tanner, her dad, Walter, and the Daughters of Charity, and the Hanson's Museum. So it's a fascinating story. So be prepared. If you haven't read it yet, get King of the Armadillos. You're going to love it.
It's a great book, and if you're a lover of fiction, I think you're going to love it because I love what she talks about in this interview about the decision to go from nonfiction about her father's story to making it a fiction novel based on a true story and true events. And so, what a cool way to make it a universal experience for people to be able to connect and to distill that character, those themes and values into something that's truly compelling. So get the book, enjoy the interview, and share this episode on social media or send it to a friend. It really helps people to get to know the podcast. God bless you guys. Enjoy.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth. And as you know, you're listening to In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity. And I'm just delighted today to be in the company of two very special people. First, we are in the company of Wendy Chin-Tanner. Wendy has written a book called The King of the Armadillos, which has a special connection to the company of the Daughters of Charity related to Carville Hospital, which was in Louisiana. And we're going to talk more about that, but that's our connection. Wendy is a poet. She has two books of poetry, Turn and Anyone Will Tell You, and Embodied, which is an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology. Then she shifted a little bit and wrote this historical fiction book called King of the Armadillos, which we're going to talk about today. She and her husband are also the co-founders of an independent publishing company of graphic novels called Wave Blue World. We're also here today with Sister Catherine Brown, who's a daughter of Charity, a friend of mine. Sister Catherine and I were in formation together, which means, we kind of started as newer members of the company at the same time. And Sister Catherine is currently working in Evansville, Indiana, at the Peyton Manning Children's Hospital Center for Children. And she is serving there as a patient navigator. So I welcome both of you today to the podcast. I'm so happy that we were able to get started on this project, which is going to take a few episodes because the story of Carville is a very important one. But our connection right now is with Wendy. And so, Wendy, tell us about King of the Armadillos. How did this book come about? Your shift from poetry to fiction or to narrative in this way, and how it connects with your personal life.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, sisters. I'm delighted to be on this podcast and to be doing this series with you. I feel like the Daughters of Charity are collaborators with me on this project to get the historical record right and to even put Carville on the historical record at all. I feel like this is a piece of forgotten history, not only for the patients and the amazing community that they created, but also for the sisters who were such an integral part of that community. They were not only part of the nursing staff, they were not only part of the research staff, but they were part of the community, which I consider to be a kind of family. We call it a Carville family. So, thank you for being members of it. I truly appreciate it. And, speaking on behalf of all of the other descendants of the patients, I think I can safely say that we are so grateful to have this opportunity. So thank you for your question too. King of the Armadillos is historical fiction set in New York City and Louisiana in the 1950s. And it focuses on the experience of a young man named Victor Chin. After emigrating from China as a little boy, Victor is a high schooler living in the Bronx at the back of the laundry that his father owns there when he's diagnosed with Hansen's disease, otherwise known as leprosy. His case is severe. He needs surgery and extensive treatment. So he's sent to the Federal Institution for the Treatment of Leprosy in Carville, Louisiana, where he has to stay in quarantine until or unless he's cured. At first, Victor feels like he's been banished to a prison in the middle of nowhere, but soon he meets a community of other patients from all over the country and all walks of life who become his friends and mentors and, in some cases, rivals. As his body begins to heal, Victor falls in love for the first time, and he discovers that he has a gift for music. But when the chance to get well and to finally go home comes on the horizon, Victor has some very difficult choices to make. So King of the Armadillos is a coming-of-age story, but it's also the story of a complicated Chinese-American immigrant family that was inspired by my own. Like Victor, when my dad was a little boy, he also had to leave my grandmother behind in China to go live with my grandfather at the back of the laundry he owned in the Bronx. And like Victor, when he was a teenager, when my dad was 16, not 15, in 1954, he was also diagnosed with Hansen's disease and sent to Carville, where he stayed for 9 years, for longer than Victor. My dad was there from 1954 to 1963. So Carville is a big piece of my family history, and it's also a piece of who I am. I don't think I would be the person that I am had we not had this formative time in my dad's life. I think he very much parented from that place because he learned how to be an American citizen, I think, very much so in terms of his political indoctrination at Carville. And I think it very much formed his personal values as a human being, as a man. So Carville is a culture from which I consider myself a member. I feel like I have roots there. As for how I transitioned from poetry into fiction. I will say that that was a very circuitous and reluctant route. I think I was dragged kicking and screaming into writing fiction at all, because before I attempted to write this book, I had never written fiction in any capacity. I had never even written a short story. So I considered my genre to be, in creative writing, I considered my genre to be poetry. And my academic training was in sociology. So I knew how to write a sociology paper and I knew how to write a poem, but I had no idea how to write a novel. I first, when my dad gave me permission to write about Carville, and he helped me get all of this research material. At first, I thought I was going to write it as nonfiction because that seemed like the most obvious thing to do with historical and biographical material. So I still wasn't sure how to create the narrative of a book of historical nonfiction. I mean, that's also a very difficult thing to do. You do have to create a kind of arc or series of arcs when you're writing any kind of book, regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But I thought maybe that would be an easier first step for me in any case. But I decided to lean on sociology. In sociology, we believe that the answers are always in the data. So I collected data. And boy, was there a lot of data. So my dad was able to get me sort of a backstage pass to the archives at Carville, which are beautifully kept. They are incredibly extensive, beautifully kept by the curator, Elizabeth Scheck-Snyder, whom I think we will meet on a subsequent podcast episode. And she has now become a family friend after I've pestered her for 5 years on every single point of the historical pieces in the novel. But, you know, we even at the beginning, the first piece of mail to come from Carville consisted of hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentary material, of photographs, of my dad's medical records. To say that it was overwhelming would be a gross understatement. And the more I dug, the more material I got, the more intrigued I got, but also the more overwhelmed I got, I would say. But, you know, I just tried to read everything I could get my hands on about Carville, particularly about the period in which I was writing. I knew I was going to be writing about the 1950s, which was the heyday of Carville. That was, you know, when the patient community was at its height in terms of their activity, but also in terms of their population. There were about 500 people there at the time. So it was very much like a little town, and it was entirely self-sufficient. I'd say that the watershed moment for research was when my dad and I took a trip to Carville in 2016. And that was his first time back in 53 years. So that was an incredible moment for him. He gave this oral history, which lasted for 3 hours, I believe. So, you know, I tip my hat to the person who had to transcribe it. But it was also a research trip. So I found even more materials in the archives, oral histories, for example, that were given by other patients. I was looking for ones that were given by young people at the time because I knew I was writing about young people. But in that session in the archives, what I discovered was that even though there was a 15% Asian American population at that time in Carville, which is a very high percentage if you compare it to the percentage in the rest of the country, there was not a single firsthand narrative by an Asian American patient. So I was very shocked to discover that. And that compelled me, though, even further to write this book and to create that historical record. So eventually, when I sat down to write, the first couple of chapters came out as nonfiction, but the more I went along, the more characters started to come to me whose histories I could not possibly research but they were very insistent and very loud. So I wrote them down. I wrote down these scenes thinking, oh, I'll probably just cut them out later. You know, it's a sort of throat clearing that you sometimes do when you're writing. But they were very insistent and persistent. They stayed in my head. So that was the first clue that probably it should be fiction. But I still was too afraid of fiction, I think, to admit that I needed to do this. I think that it took until I was trying to portray Victor's experience as a young man discovering music that I hit the real roadblock, because I myself am not a musician. My dad taught me how to play the piano, and he taught me how to sing, and I also took lessons in voice and piano when I was growing up, but I am not a musician. So it's very difficult, I think, to research your way around that. I felt like I couldn't research my way around that. So in desperation, I ended up trying a writing exercise where I translated or transposed my own relationship with poetry, particularly my awakening as a young poet when I was in high school. I transposed that experience to Victor's. And so in that way, I kind of made Victor more myself. And all of a sudden, the character of Victor became alive in a way that he hadn't been before. And I think the reason that he hadn't been before was because when he was absolutely based on my dad and I was trying to stay faithful to his experience, I felt too self-conscious to make him a full person. Real people have all kinds of character flaws and foibles, and they're messy, and they have all kinds of thoughts that they shouldn't, and they do all kinds of things that they shouldn't. But I think we all idealize our parents, and it was difficult for me to write the character that way when I was thinking of him as my dad. And my dad was also reading over my shoulder a lot of the time, which was very helpful in terms of correcting historical inaccuracies or anachronisms. That was great. But he was also, I think, uncomfortable with anything that I wrote that didn't align with his own perception and his own narrative of what happened. So I think making it fiction gave us both the freedom to enjoy it, and also to, for me anyway, to really find the story within the facts.
Yeah, I just I love that idea of moving from the nonfiction into fiction, which sounds like it actually broadened for you the story. So it helped not just you, but your dad be able to tell a story about one man, uh, but that one man then represents all of the people who are at Carville in some way or another. That um, that's such a beautiful way, and in some ways poetic, right? In the sense of poetry expressing the fullness of humanity, which I think is what we really get from this book. Is this just this sense um, of humanity's desire to survive, you know, our need to survive, but also to create community, that survival, healing, reconciliation, all of the things that had to happen in this book have to happen in community one way or another, even if it's in a closed community. I was really struck by how contemporary some of the issues were, and I wanted to bring Sister Catherine in now to talk a little bit about your reaction. Both Sister Catherine and I have read King of the Armadillos, and for me the fascinating part was it does tell the story of a work of the Daughters of Charity that to us is part of history. We know the importance of our work there, but we tend in many ways to be kind of quieter about our work when we've left someplace and we've left it to others to do. Our story becomes a part of it, not the whole story. But I know the daughters were incredibly important characters, and some appear in your book. But Sister Catherine, tell us about your experience as you read it. You have a special connection with Carville as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, Wendy, thank you so much. It's such a great read. And I always say, when you don't want the book to end, that means it's a great read. And so I'd really like to put out there to people. It is definitely, it's a fast read. It's also very interesting. And I grew up in Louisiana. I grew up in southern Louisiana. And so Carville was kind of like a mythical place, in a way. It wasn't, it was almost not real. And I had several relatives who were involved in healthcare. So sometimes you would hear people make mention of it. You heard things about it, but it wasn't as if I had ever really like been there. Like I said, it was some sort of a mythical kind of place. And then when I was in the process of becoming a daughter of charity, one of our sisters, we were doing some research into where all of our sisters were buried around Louisiana, and she asked me to help. And I said that would be fine. So Sister Mary Kay Heenan and I took a trip to Carville to see where our sisters were buried, but also to see Carville. And that to me was it was just one of those places that truly just touched me and made me realize that, what our sisters did there, the more you learned about it, when they first went there and they literally had to sleep with axes by their beds because there were cottonmouth snakes that would come into their rooms in the middle of the night, water moccasins. And one of the things I was talking to another one of our sisters was that she said, normally at that time, people were just assigned places. You were going to go here, you were going to go there, and we didn't really talk about it. You were just going to go. But when they were looking for people to go to Carville, that was one of the first times that people were actually asked to volunteer. And our provincial thought maybe they'd get maybe like 10 volunteers, and they got over 100 people who were willing to volunteer to go to Carville. And so for me, it's always just been one of those places that it makes me proud. It makes me realize that our sisters were willing to go where no one else was willing to go because people were definitely afraid. And what I'd really like to say about your book is what I love about it is that you did a very good job of helping us see the world through Victor's eyes, through a young adolescent's eyes. And, it gives it a freshness, it gives it a newness to it. And it just very much was a way of seeing things the way a young adolescent would. And I was very grateful for that.
Oh,
So I love the book.
thank you so much, Sister Catherine. I'm so curious to hear why you think that so many sisters wanted to volunteer to go to Carville. I'm very interested to know that. 100 people, that's incredible.
I think definitely our fourth vow of service to the poor. And who could be more poor than people who had been sent and were incarcerated? They hadn't been convicted of anything, but they were incarcerated there. And so I think those sisters were willing to really truly live out that fourth vow of service to the poor because there wasn't anybody who was more poor than the people who were going to Carville. Even they had to give up their identities, many of them, and change their names because they didn't want the rest of their family to be, mocked or shunned or whatever, because at that time, people, it's such a biblical disease. And when you read other books about it, the other books like The Colony, and The Sanctuary of Outcasts, and many other books about it, you realize that leprosy, it's such a scary thing because with the biblical piece of it, people feel like it was sinful. It had all these other things attached to it that when someone was diagnosed with leprosy, it was essentially a death sentence to the person that they were. But thank God that the people in Carville and the doctors and everyone and the community that they formed gave people new life. It's almost like they got a new life. They died and rose in a certain way.
Yeah, I would have to agree that I think the reason so many sisters volunteered was one, we were a community of sisters who worked in healthcare, and the sisters would understand the need for a facility to care for people, certainly. So they had the skills in many ways. But I think also, as Catherine is saying, our fourth vow, or really our first vow of service to the poor, we come to the community to be of service to anyone, anywhere, right? And that we say in our constitutions that no form of poverty is foreign to a daughter of charity. So the sense that this wouldn't necessarily, and I would agree that probably our leadership probably thought this is going to be a little scary, and we're asking, which is not something Daughters of Charity are used to, right? We're consulted, we may be given a couple of options nowadays. Back in the late 1800s, that would, and we were at Carville, for a long time, over 100 years, that it would not have been the norm for somebody at that point to choose her mission. But where sisters were being asked, and this was such an important work, I can imagine why. And it makes me very proud to think that, in that time, 100 Daughters of Charity would step up and say, that's what we're called to do, is to be with those most abandoned, those who are the most vulnerable in our society, which I think is one of the things I was saying, that sense of the contemporary found in a story that you tell back in the 50s, but that we know goes back really to the late 1800s, that it has all of the kind of the social sins, as well as the ways in which people of goodwill try to create a community that can be supportive. So issues around isolation of people who are ill with communicable disease, immigration issues, issues around race, just in the area of Louisiana at that time. Anyways, as you said, Wendy, that 15% of the people there were Asian, and yet none of the stories that you were able to find were of the Asian population there. It just speaks, I think, too, to how these issues in our world continue even today. And so I just wonder how did that impact your writing of the story as well? I mean, did you, as you were doing the research, were you at all surprised, or did you feel like, gosh, in some ways we've not moved very much forward? We can cure diseases, or we can find solutions, but there are ways in which we treat one another that aren't cured so easily.
Yeah, I think if we look at history, we can see that it's somewhat cyclical, right? Or if not cyclical, it at least moves forward in ellipses and in cycles. So we're in a darker part of our cycle right now, but I like to think that overall we're moving forward slowly, more slowly than we would like, but still we're going in that direction. And part of that is, I think I see in my daughter's generation, especially. My daughter is 16 years old. I have two, but my older one is 16. She's Gen Z. And I see that there is so much of a vocabulary for seeing the world as it is and understanding the systems at play. And so I think that we're breaking silence at the very least in this era, which is one of the things that we're doing here on this podcast too. But I see that as something that is very important in terms of bringing us forward as a society. I think historical fiction also has a particular capacity to almost force the reader to look at the juxtaposition between what is happening now and what was happening in the time period of the book. We cannot help but put ourselves into these people's shoes. And in doing so, we bring our own contemporary issues to look at what is happening in that story. So that's a really amazing tool that's built into the structure of historical fiction to speak about the now at the same time as we are speaking about then. So that was one of the things that I thought very explicitly about in writing this book. I don't think I can let go of being a sociologist in some ways. So I do kind of approach my creative work through that lens, and through the lens of an intersectional sense of what people are doing and why they're doing it, and in what context they're doing it. I also wanted to speak to something you said a bit earlier, Sister Elizabeth, this idea of the drive to survive. And I love this idea. And I thought very deeply about this idea. What is the difference between merely staying alive and living, right? So this book is about people who are surviving thanks to medical care and thanks to the spiritual care of the sisters who were there. But because of the community at large, and because they were able to tap into this creative spirit and this life force, they were able to have lives. They were able to be alive in a way that I don't think they would have been able to otherwise. So I think that there's something incredibly unique about all the different people who came together in that place. And because so many people spent their lives there, that also created a feeling of family. You know, there were people there who, you know, got there as children and stayed to the very ends of their life. My dad was lucky enough to be discharged after 9 years when he was 25 years old, but that was not the case for many of his peers and many of the other patients there. It's interesting what you said too, Sister Catherine, about people changing their names. Yes, the majority of people did choose to change their names to spare their families from the incredible stigma of the disease, which still exists today. But I think it speaks to who my dad is, that he did not change his name. My dad's name is Walter, and he was Walter the whole time he was there. So I think that's an interesting little tidbit. But also in terms of the danger of the disease, I think it's important to note that actually, scientifically speaking, there was no reason whatsoever for quarantine, because it is not a highly communicable disease. 95% of the human population is naturally immune, and even that unlucky 5%, they require really close and prolonged exposure to someone with an active infection in order to become sick with it themselves. So the reason for the quarantine was political. It was not scientific. And the cure has been known since 1941. That was the miracle of Carville when they discovered the cure. And yet the federal quarantine persisted until the 1960s. So I think that shows us the power of fear. And one of the things that the sisters, I think, so crucially helped with the patients, particularly young patients, I think, was to dispel the fear.
Yeah, you know, as you're talking about that sense that 95% of the population is not susceptible, it's not contagious. How did you come up with the title King of the Armadillos?
Yes. Well, let's start with the armadillos. Armadillos are the only other creature besides human beings that can contract leprosy. And so they became a very vital source of research at Carville. Now, I fudged the facts a little bit because they didn't actually start being actively researched at Carville until the 1960s, and I'm writing in the 1950s, but I had the sort of lead scientist, my character, Sister Helen, come up with the idea. So, and I think that's quite apropos because Sister Helen was based on a real sister, Sister Hilary Ross, who was the head of the lab and the head of research. And she was a very, very important part of finding the cure, the miracle of Carville. So I wanted to kind of give her that idea of the armadillos being a very important thing and to drive forward the research around them. But armadillos are also a metaphor in the book, right? They have this armor, and yet they're so susceptible. And the armor, I think, speaks to the numbness and the disassociation that many of the patients feel that they require in order to survive this really harrowing experience. But as we discover in the book, you know, these sorts of coping mechanisms can become maladaptive over time. And it's not a good thing to be numb. And it's not a good thing to be disassociated. So part of the journey for Victor in this book is to become reintegrated spiritually as his body heals. So it's a kind of dual healing. He's healing from his trauma at the same time as he is healing from his illness.
I think the other thing that was very interesting is the armadillos were also, and now since we're in the season of Mardi Gras, was the name of the crew where they did a parade and a ball and everything, just like in the book every year they would do, and it was the crew of the Armadillos, I think. And the fact that the cover of your book is in the Mardi Gras colors, it's in purple, green, and gold. I thought that was so interesting. And so our
Exactly.
sisters would participate in the crew of Armadillos every year. So they even had their own Mardi Gras parades. And that is, that's just so, it's amazing because it gave them such, a cultural spirit, something to celebrate, have fun with. And I love the way Victor and his friends make floats and everything in the book. And the scene where, he's playing and dancing, it was just lovely. It was a lovely way to look at it.
Oh, thank you. That's exactly right. I should say that the king piece of King of the Armadillos is a nod to Mardi Gras, which is incredibly important in that region and incredibly important at Carville. It was the biggest event of the season, even bigger than Christmas. And my dad did participate, of course, in the Mardi Gras balls and the Mardi Gras parades. In real life, he wasn't king of the Mardi Gras. The king and the queen of the Mardi Gras ball, that was kind of a popularity contest, I suppose. They always chose a young woman and a young man who were kind of like the homecoming king and homecoming queen, of Carville. So my dad never did actually get to be king of the Mardi Gras ball, but he was a duke in the royal court of the Mardi Gras ball when he was in high school. But the king part also refers to the kind of biblical quality that that surrounds the idea of leprosy, and also because, of course, Carville itself was a very religious and spiritual place.
I think another thing was the people who were working there, not just the sisters, but like the orderly that you have in the book. I think he's a great character. His real name was, Sidney Levinson, and he did publish, the newspaper, for years and years, and that gave people an opportunity to put out something. They were almost like people stuck on an island together.
Yes, not only did he publish the magazine, it was called the Star Magazine, which, by the way, grew to have an international circulation of 90,000 at one point at the height of it, which is an incredible achievement. Stanley Stein was an extremely interesting figure. I couldn't leave him out of the book. He was so important to the history of Carville and also important to my dad in real life. My dad was, he knew him and he was one of his mentees, you could say. Stanley Stein was, by the time my dad got there in the 1950s, he had already been a patient there for over 20 years, and he had Hansen's disease from before there was a cure. So his case was so severe that he was heavily disabled. He couldn't walk without a cane, and eventually he was in a wheelchair. He became blind from the disease and also eventually deaf because it's a systemic illness. It affects the nerves. But even though most people who are blind can read Braille, he was unable to do so because his fingers had become so insensitive from the disease that they couldn't feel the bumps to read the Braille. So he had to have everything read out loud to him. And so he had a group of volunteers to do so. And my dad was one of his volunteer readers. But this magazine, the mission of it was to shine a light on the truth of Hansen's disease and to destigmatize and humanize its sufferers. So I consider my book, or I hope my book, is a part of the continuation of that legacy. One of the things that I wanted to say at the center of this book was that people are people, no matter where they are, no matter when they are. I don't care if we're in an 18th century castle in France or if we're in a leper colony, in quotation marks, in the 1950s. We all have the same fundamental sets of feelings, emotions, drives. We all make mistakes and we have to live with their consequences. right? So that was fundamentally what I wanted to say in this book. And by telling it in fiction, I hope that I was able to allow the reader to get inside of the interiority, to get inside of the experience, emotionally, physically, etc., of being a patient. So I think in nonfiction, sometimes it's more like a looking at something from the outside, but fiction is capable of accomplishing this incredible feat of letting you inside someone else's skin, inside someone else's head. And I think that can be a very powerful tool for empathy.
And so, our next episode will be with our two archivists, and I think ourselves, Wendy and myself, having another conversation about where did these facts come from? How have they been preserved? Sister Catherine and I know, Daughters of Charity involved. There are annals. I'm sure there's almost minute by minute documents of life in Carville. We are meticulous in the way we record the history of our work. So I'm sure that Scott has a treasure trove of information that can be shared and added to this story. Yeah, so I thank both of you for your time today and for the time coming forward, because this story doesn't end here. This is our beginning, and so your fascination, our dear listeners, to this, get the book, read the book, and then come back to the podcast to see the next installment where our two archivists will get together. If you haven't heard an archivist conversation, you're going to be amazed at what these people know and how they express it. And so we're going to really be anticipating that. So thank you both again. And we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you, sisters.
Thank you. God bless.